Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our sixth installment of Democracy and Vulnerability, hosted by the Wende Museum, Thomas Mann House, and dublab Radio. My name is Amy Cabrales, and I'm very excited, along with my fellow student council members, to welcome Ajuan Mance to the program today. Ajuan Mance is a professor of African American literature at Mills College in Oakland, an artist, and a writer. As for her artistic career, Mance creates comics, fine art pieces, and illustrations. Her style of portraiture is inspired by graffiti, street art, and stained glass windows, each of which are characterized by lots of color. In her own words, Mance uses bright color and humor to, quote, explore race, gender, power, and the people and places in which they intersect, end quote. She has released 3 art books titled 1001 Black Men, Portraits of Masculinity at the Intersections, Living While Black, Portraits of Everyday Resistance, and What Do Brothas Do All Day. Mance has also written 2 books about literature, an anthology of African American literature from the long 19th century titled Before Harlem, and a historical survey of African American women poets and self-representation from 1877 to the year 2000, titled Inventing Black Women. It does not come as a surprise that her work has appeared in numerous media outlets such as BET, BuzzFeed, The New York Times, and Publishers Weekly, to list a few. Her targeted audience is anyone who is open to understanding the value of Black lives. Today's program will follow a 1-hour discussion with Ajuan Mance, moderated by student council member Matthew Jones. Members Emma Larson, Zora Nelson, and I will also pose questions to Ajuan Mance. Emma will write the blog post for this episode, which will be uploaded on the Thomas Mann House website shortly after the interview is uploaded online. We'd also like to extend our thanks to Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for their generous support for the online and on-site discussion series at the Venda. Ajuan, it's a pleasure to have you here with us this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Now I'd like to pass it to Matt to begin our discussion.
Hi, everybody. So glad to have you here and so excited for this installment in our Democracy and Vulnerability series. As you'll notice, even though this series title is about democracy and vulnerability, there will not be too many questions directly about democracy in this particular interview. Instead, there will be quite a few questions about representation and community uplift and everyday life, specifically for Black Americans. I'm sure it will come up during our conversation, but I just want to make sure that the connection is explicit, that a core vulnerability of US democracy has been a hypocritical failure to actually be representative, as it has institutionalized forms of inequality, dehumanization, and racism. A healthy democracy aspires to equal representation and participation, but historically, the US government has failed to do this. So in this talk, we're going to zoom in a bit and discuss ways to address some of these core fundamental problems surrounding racial justice and cultural perceptions, understanding that such issues are essential to addressing democratic vulnerabilities. So to begin things, we're going to have a couple questions about artistic style and inspirations in Dr. Mance's work, and we'll begin with Emma.
Hi, Dr. Mance. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Looking at your artwork, your artistic style is so distinctive and inspired by graffiti and even stained glass, which I learned in the introduction. But the colors are so bright, the works are often really two-dimensional. There are thick black lines of outlining. And I'm curious, could you speak a little bit about how you arrived at this style and why you think that this style specifically is an effective means to explore questions of race, gender, and power?
Oh, sure. And thank you, Amy, for the introduction. And thank you, Matt, for bringing us into the space. And it's really wonderful to be here. You know, I've been doing art for as long as I can remember. It was the thing that I was doing when I wasn't asleep or in school for most of my life. But of course, I did my graduate work in English. And during that time period, I did some freelance work, but for the most part, did not do much in the way of developing an art practice. When I did engage, you know, after my first year of being a professor, it became abundantly clear to me that the tools that PhD in English had given me were great tools, but there were some stories I needed to tell and some questions I needed to explore that I couldn't do using those tools. And so I have always been attracted to art forms that are seeking to tell a story or follow a line of inquiry. I'm also very interested in the work of illustrators, which I only realize now that I also teach illustration. And so I was really attracted to forms that do that. You know, graffiti is about telegraphing a message to other people and to audiences you probably will never meet. Also, the rise of street art, kind of on the heels of graffiti and murals, kind of bringing those two things together, was really compelling to me. And people who created street logos, you know, now we think of people like Banksy, but there's such a huge range, very diverse. And then, you know, stained glass windows use color in a way that has always been so compelling to me. And I like color because you can tell it's very expressive, but also as a person of African descent, I almost use my relationship to color as a way of connecting to African ancestry that has been separated from me by the historical amnesia of slavery. And so, you know, those three things came together. I wanted to use art as a tool to explore, to communicate, and so that's really how my style developed.
No, that's amazing. And I think Amy's going to follow up on that with a question about some of your more theoretical underpinnings for the aesthetic choices you've made.
Mhm.
Yes. So my question related to what I mentioned in the introduction about how your website, in your bio, it says that you create work. You use humor and bright colors to explore race, gender, power, and the peoples and places in which they intersect. And considering I'm a sociology major, that instantly reminded me of a theory called intersectionality. And it was a theory coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And it comes up a lot in my studies. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but if you are, would you say that intersectionality appears often in your work? What are your thoughts on this framework? And would you say it helps promote more representation?
Oh yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. Because when everyone was introducing themselves earlier before we got on, when you were talking about your work, I thought about intersectionality as it applies in a lot of the work you're describing, and my work is very much informed by that. You know, most of my subjects in the work that I do for myself, when I'm creating work for a show, for example, is about Black people. I do a more diverse representations for clients and for public art, those types of things. But yeah, that intersection, it's really in some ways impossible for me to think about Blackness without thinking about those things that intersect with Blackness. And it's kind of one of those moments in which, you know, when you're inside an identity, that identity feels richly diverse. When I'm in a room full of people who are not Black, I'm the Black person in the room. But in my mind, I'm always surrounded by Black people. And so that identity feels very diverse. And so, you know, my longest and deepest exploration was the 6.5 years I spent doing 1,001 portraits of Black men. And that for me was very much about the intersections that I could see. But I wasn't, but I wanted to challenge myself because there's so little representation, so little visual media that captures Black men and masculinity, particularly as an intersectional identity. I mean, I could say also there's very little media that captures Black womanhood as an identity at all. But but I was very interested in looking at intersectionality in the community of people who identify as Black people who are men.
I really like the way that you are just talking about, like, yeah, you're surrounded in a sense by representation of Black folk, but then there's also that realization of, you know, how much of like what you're seeing is not being perceived by the rest of America, right? How often, you know, you become so quickly aware of how your daily life is being either misrepresented or just completely ignored by broader representations in pop culture or media or political life. And yeah, and how that's one of the reasons why intersectionality is so essential, because it's bringing all of that life to bear in representation. Having just flat representations that focus on only one element of Black life isn't really true representation. And I think Zora is going to follow up with a question kind of bringing us into the next section, which is dealing primarily with representation and American perception.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you again, Dr. Mans, for being here with us. I absolutely love your work, and this conversation has already been very vivid and just has resonated a lot. And I wanted to mention that in past interviews, you, of course, as you just mentioned, heavily emphasized the criticalness of representation within art and its significance. And, I've noticed that especially lately, there's been much media discourse, especially from people of color, surrounding how representation is truly presented to us, as we see more TV shows and movies, trying, I guess, to sprinkle it in. And I wanted to ask, do you believe that any kind of representation is valid? Especially given historical tropes and roles that Black people have been subjected to in the media. Do you think it is important to then also break down these tropes / stereotypes and diversify the kinds of representation we're even seeing right now, if that makes sense?
Oh, that totally makes sense. And I think that's such a wonderful question. And mentioning those historical tropes, I teach in the MFA comics program at California College of the Arts during their summer program, and sometimes during the fall and spring. And one of the things that I do in a workshop is I teach about drawing diversity. And I'll be teaching that next week. And I want to bring in, and I always have to figure out the best way to do this, representations of how, for example, comics and cartoons have been used to reinforce horribly negative stereotypes of people of color. And so this is all to say that I don't think all representation is good representation. That's a really great question. As you were asking, I was thinking, I think I do want to say, and there are exceptions, but for the most part, when a group seeks to depict itself, I do think there's space for all of the different ways that, say, Black people interpret Blackness. It's one of the and it still remains a point of controversy. I think about people like my mother, who grew up under Jim Crow segregation, is 81 years old, and for her, there's absolutely a right way and a wrong way to depict Black people. But I think that part of us claiming our privilege as African Americans, and I think any group, trans folks, women of all genders, Muslim folks, any group that isn't seen that much, what we do is we claim space by saying that there's no one right way to be who we are. And so, I do think there's room for, the Black gangster as Black people interpret that figure, and as well as the kind of talented 10th respectability politics Black person on that show. I think there's space for all of those. And I think that's a way of resisting this notion of simplifying and interpreting Blackness for audiences, when really the power move is to complicate Blackness for those audiences.
Yeah, I really agree with the statement of complicating the image, because I feel like, I don't know, especially like on social media, I feel like a lot of the time we get this one representation of not just Black people, but just different people in society, and we don't realize that that's not the sole like generalization image. So I definitely agree with to complicate things. And next question is about an interview you had with the California Institute of Integral Studies in 2014 about how African American artists and Black artists, they have had to be very protective about the images being portrayed in their work. And so over the years and since then, what type of feedback has your audience and or the Black community given you about your work? And has it inspired you with new ideas about what to create, or has it made you feel vulnerable, or any other effects it has had on you since then?
That's I like that question. And how I feel about those things is both different and the same as in 2014, when I was kind of in the throes of creating 1001 Black Men. And for the most part, I've gotten really positive feedback from Black audiences, which is great, because that's what I want. I want Black audiences to feel seen And so, one of the things I've said is I did a little bit of a book tour this spring for my children's book, was that when someone comes up to me and says, "Oh, this guy here on page 9 reminds me of my cousin," that shows me that yes, I've hit it. I've captured something that feels accessible. I want everyone to feel, like I said, that someone sees them. But I also have found but it also is, I do feel very vulnerable in some ways. When I started, a lot of my children's book is called What Do Brothas Do All Day? And so a lot of the focus is on different ways of being a Black man or boy. And although this wasn't intentional, there is a degree to which, when I'm depicting people who are in a group of which I am not a part, um, there is a little bit of a distance between me and the work. And I've definitely had very limited, but a couple of older Black women who definitely felt very protective of the Black image, particularly the Black male image. And I think my work for them felt a little bit too close to caricature. Um, and if I was, I get it. I don't necessarily agree that that's where it's coming from. But that is such a rare, what's important to me is that Black men have looked at the work and said, "Oh yeah, this is what we look like." The vulnerability comes when I start depicting a more diverse audience. And so in my book, Living While Black, for example, I include many more women, and also one figure in particular who I identify as trans. And so being part of the LGBTQ community, that felt like I was being a bit more exposed. And then I released a book of comics in March called Gender Studies, based kind of autobiographical comics with a twist. I can't really time travel, but I do in the book. And that also addresses most of the same issues, but through the lens of my experience. And that does feel very, I do feel quite vulnerable still having that work out in the world.
I found it really interesting you bringing up just this almost like innate defense that particularly like older Black people have while encountering your work. And I feel like that really speaks to just like that deeply rooted, almost just like generational trauma, honestly. And, like unfortunately, there is a deep history with the images portrayed of Black people in the media, minstrelsy, and cartoon pictures, as you brought up, just being too. And, we were just talking about this, and I'm sure this question has been presented to you numerous times in the past, but I wanted to ask if you would speak more on how you navigate that specifically, like being like a cartoonist. And with such a gruesome and painful history, do you think it is at all possible to reclaim these portrayals in a way?
That is, wow, that's very interesting. And because I think about this a lot, and talk about this a lot with students, and I do think it is possible. I'm going to the paradigmatic example to me is Jean Luen Yang, An American Born Chinese. That graphic novel that then became a TV show, like Go Gene, who I think was a math teacher before he made that book, um, um, and many since then. But uses his graphic novel, and I see this also with Maya Kobe's Genderqueer, and a lot of Black graphic novelists like Lawrence Lindell's Blackward, which is up for a bunch of awards right now, that folks use their work to teach people how to see them. Those grotesques of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 60s, all the way up, used these stereotyped visions to remind people that even if these folks live down the street from you, look at these cartoons and remember they're not people the way you are. And so the power of not just writing on the page, but also showing you, this is what I see when I look in the mirror. This is what I see when I look at the Black people around me. I think it can be a very, very powerful tool for um, rebuilding and decentering the kind of marginalizing stereotypes and actually walking people through your own vision. When you look at Black people in this book, this is what you see. And there's a degree to which people bring that with them when they step outside of the experience of the text. That becomes part of their lens, and it's very exciting to me to see more and more people, more and more Black people get involved in creating comics and graphic novels.
So much of the justice work that minority communities have to do just begins with that very act of making those in power or their oppressors just even see them even remotely accurately, like beyond all these caricatures and misperceptions and stuff like that. And I really loved this quote that you had, where you talk about one of the strengths of Black Americans is, and I quote, the capacity to see the beauty and the power and the wonder in each other, even as you live, and that's the end quote, even as you live in a society that often denies or assaults that very beauty. And, without pretending that it would be equivalent, I was just wondering if you had advice for those who are listening about like, how can we all develop that capacity to see beauty and wonder in others, and I guess the world more generally, because I just think that fear and ugliness are so politically and economically exploitable. We just see it constantly, right? That, people, authoritarians and all these other political systems exploit fear and exploit the perception of ugliness in others. And it seems like it's really important for us to develop ways to resist those impulses and actually learn how to see first the beauty in others and the beauty in the world. And I was just wondering, yeah, if you had any just simple tips or tricks for beginning that process.
Oh yeah. And for me, for doing it for Black people is easy for me. I, kind of grew up in that space. But I will say, I'm always trying to grow that capacity. When I was doing my 1001 Black Men, probably the first 250 drawings were disproportionately people who looked like people I'd gone to grad school with or people who I see at my family reunions. That's not diversity. That's a lot of people with the same educational and class background as mine. So I even had to train my own vision to look at to see more broadly. I would say, Bell Hook's Loving Blackness as Political Resistance really remains one of my guiding lights in terms of what you were talking about, this power. There's a power that resists, and I don't want to necessarily get into the history of economics, but it does resist some of the big business in not liking yourself or other people who are different or the same by encouraging you to see your own empowerment through loving groups and celebrating groups of whom you are not a part. Bell Hooks calls on everyone to love Blackness as a way of liberating themselves from the stuff that you're told you're not supposed to do. And I have found some of the same things in, as we come up with more diverse notions of gender. It's been wonderful to watch people like my brother, who is a cisgender heterosexual Black man, really embrace as some of his closest friends trans and non-binary people, and it is liberating to him to be able to not feel confined by what people say masculinity is supposed to be, and who people say your enemies are supposed to be. And so that's what I would I would say, if society is telling you that these are your adversaries, probably the best bet is for you to run toward them. And if you're an art person, if you draw or write or make music, that can be a tool for doing this also. Um, or even just making sure that other people are aware of the art that people of a different group than yours find empowering. As a teacher, I find myself having to do that a lot. I am learning a lot to see, well, what is the art that folks who are from Bangladesh find really empowering and truly representative of what it is to be from Bangladesh but living in the United States? Well, that's what I'm going to put on the syllabus. It's not about what I think is the best. It's about me letting go and letting some other folks and their aesthetics teach me what they want other people to read.
I think that's beautiful. And, one of the things that I keep coming back to is I've never regretted finding one more thing worth my attention, one more thing beautiful in the world. Like there's nothing lost by expanding how much joy we find in the world. So even for those of you watching who might be trying to figure out how to, navigate that or move forward, or who might be uncomfortable with that, think of it as just a practice of joy, actually, of expanding um, the beauty that you see in the world. There's only something to gain. I wanna pivot to a comment you made about how wonderful it's been for you to see kind of your brother be changed through the conversations he's had with you and through your work. And we're going to turn it over to Emma, who's going to launch kind of the next section, which is specifically about gender and about how you use gender in your work and about why you choose to focus on what you do.
Yeah, so gender is a huge theme of your work, and though gender and gender studies are obviously about all the genders that exist and the dynamics between them, I'm struck by the fact that Black masculinity plays such a central role to a lot of the work that you've done. I'd love to hear more about what in your mind drives you to focus on that specific gendered experience. Why is that? Why are Black men maybe not in the most need of new representation, but why have you decided to focus a lot of your artistic work on representation of Black masculinity?
That's such an interesting question. And I have concrete answers. I can give you 3 answers. 2 of them are very short. One is masculinity is more legible to me aesthetically. It's a vibe that has always resonated with me, even as a kid. As a kid, I drew mostly men or me. Um, or a lot of self-portraits as well, and animals. I like drawing animals. And so, as someone who my students assigned me pronouns in the last few years, they assigned me they, them pronouns. It's like, hey, it's the 20 teens, sure. And often, defined as masculine center. It's an interesting line of inquiry for me, something interesting to explore. But also, I, in some ways, am exploring masculinity on behalf of the whole Black community because people use, an African American in our journey here in the United States has been about these moments of hypervisibility for one gender group or hyper invisibility for a group. So just briefly, in the 19th century, there was a degree to which Black women were hyper visible in a lot of the abolitionist writings, the tragic Black woman who might be also a little bit or a lot white, and subject to the attentions of her evil owner, she was used very much as an object to sell the idea of abolition. It's a great idea. Abolition is really important to why I'm here right now. But still, those women were very much used as objects. They were never really fully developed as humans in those texts. And then once slavery is over, we see something that hasn't changed yet. Blackness becomes gendered male in the public imagination. And so when we think about objectification, as someone who used to teach women's studies when I was in grad school, it's always a white female body. And the discourse around objectification has always, in the United States, been primarily about, the liberation of white women. But what's very insidious to me is the way that Black men are used to sell ideas that are marginalizing to every Black person in this country. And so that's one of the main reasons I've been very interested in the representation of Black men, because the notion has been since the late 1800s, if Black men aren't human, then their communities don't matter. And so we look at all of these representations that move towards the good way of not being human, being a great athlete, for example, or a great rapper or singer, and bad ways of not being human, an isolated, savage criminal. And we see those still being used this very today to marginalize African American communities. It's highly problematic. And because our notion of objectification is so gendered and so raced surrounding white womanhood, it flies below the radar and is not addressed, but it hurts everybody. And frankly, it reinforces the invisibility of Black women as well. So there's a long answer to a short question.
I think that was this a very on point way of explaining that. And I feel like something that you said that honestly just gave me goosebumps was like the idea of blackness becoming gendered male, which I was like, that's kind of just crazy. Also, just like, as a Black person, because it's like that really is so true. And just like, I know you touched a little bit on just Black women and like our role in all of this. And I want to say in your book, 1001 Black Men, you create very beautiful, colorfully vivid portraits of like the Black man which subvert the stereotypically frightening way that Black men historically have been perceived, as you were just talking about. And with similar perceptions of Black women, you just named one as the abolitionist, but also being the overtly sexualized, hypermasculine, and aggressive archetype. Are there ways that you have attempted to break down these stereotypes as well in your artwork? And with this, how do you intend for Black women to see themselves when they consume your art?
That's many people have asked, when are you going to do 1001 Black Women? And my answer is always, I learned my lesson the first time. I'm not going to do 1001 of anything else. Again, it took me twice as long as I was supposed to. But I am really interested in Black representation. And so a lot of the art that I've created for exhibitions centers Black womanhood. There's an annual exhibition series here in the Bay Area called The Black Woman is God, and it brings together African American women doing art about Black women. And so for each of those shows, I do between 2 and 4 new pieces that if, for example, I do one that imagines Nina Simone as the hero with 1,000 faces, and so that jazz and blues singer and composer has the trappings and iconography of a bunch of different gods and goddesses from global traditions. And so I am interested in historical mashups, thinking of Black women from history who would have hung out together and what would they have been doing. Sojourner Truth and Shirley Chisholm probably would have been great friends and would have gone to help protest at the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so I use art to kind of explore and revisit and in some ways maybe make more intimate and closer for me and hopefully for others by extrapolation our relationship to these historical Black figures. And I use a lot of those pieces to revisit the legacy of Black women. But I also am interested in the portrait series that I've been working on since then. All include African American women, but I'm really considering the notion of diving in and doing the story of Black women elders, and maybe doing a series that incorporates their stories, gives me the chance to interview them and incorporate some of their words in their portraits because I really like doing that kind of stuff.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. I can't wait to see that next phase of your work. We're going to pivot slightly to the next section to talk about kind of some of the fundamental moments in history that shaped your work and then how you're sort of moving into the future. So kind of as you've already mentioned some of your projects, but want to take a step back and mention how in an interview in Mother magazine, you talked about how watching the protests following George Floyd's murder made you think something had fundamentally transformed in that moment, and that you wanted to create art as a response to what you were seeing, as people took to the streets and began this, mass movement that continues to have implications today. I was just curious, 4 years later, have you noticed a lasting impact of that moment in your own work? And have there been other transformative moments recently that continue to compel your art, or that you hope to have compel your art as you go forward?
Wow, that's a great question. And 4 years hence, I do think in many ways, my work is probably transformed. I think the George Floyd protests and my feeling that I needed to respond to those in some way really was kind of part of a process that started with drawing 1001 Black Men, but it didn't start till about 800 drawings in when I started to feel a bigger sense of accountability to a wider audience. With the George Floyd protests, I think I had a sense that as an artist, I have a responsibility to create work that's fun, but I now it's less about what's fun to me just because of my idiosyncratic interests, but what are the ways that the things that I find liberating can connect me with other people's needs to see things they haven't seen before. Every now and then I'll do animations, and so the idea of an animation of a Black man in outer space. How often do we get to really see that, even with all the sci-fi that's out there? And when do we get to celebrate um our um I just did a portrait of myself. It's called A Portrait of the Artist, as the Conjure Woman's Apprentice instead of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. And I'm standing with an African American conjurer who looks kind of like my great grandmother out in the middle of the woods, and we're burning candles and pouring red palm oil, and just thinking, what do we need to see that we never get to see? Even when I'm being playful, I think, how can this way of play um, open up some access and help us to understand the histories that we were never allowed to know? I did a portrait of a mermaid, a Black mermaid, and I did a whole bunch of research on Black mermaids and found this mermaid tradition that may be tens of thousands of years old. It's centered in a part of Africa that is now mostly deserty, but it used to be covered with water, and there's this mermaid tradition. And so I drew her, and I did all this research, and put that image out there. And the response that I got was, yeah, I think that Black people need to see these images and be reminded that despite our need to focus on the everyday, there are these layers of wonder and mysticism and magic and playfulness to which we should be able to have access. And so, I guess what I could say is 4 years hence, I feel a sense of mission, um, more than anything else. And what keeps me focused, though, is that Black Americans, and globally, two things. One, Black Americans continue to make inroads. There are all these Black firsts that keep happening. And every now and then something happens, and I think, I can't believe I never thought I'd live to see something like that. And then, I'm not sure I thought I'd live to see a Black woman who is a vice president. Uh, However many criticisms people have leveled at this particular candidate. But also, what's been really important for me is that Blackness is becoming, 80% of Black people in the United States are descendants of people who were brought to the United States as indentured servants or overwhelmingly slaves. But 20% of Black Americans are the descendants of African and Caribbean immigrants. And so that diversity of Blackness is really kind of shifting a little bit of the way that I draw and imagine Black communities too, and imagine my audience.
I just want to say that I I'm really glad that you brought up those statistics, because I feel like people um, forget how like diverse the Black community like in America is. I mean, I'm a living example. Like my dad is Black American, like descendant of slaves, but my mom is an immigrant from Sierra Leone, and even within that, there's like so many cultural differences. And I feel like I love that like in your work that you're incorporating those like African tales, but also like the experience that Black Americans have today. Because I feel like within the Black community specifically, there's a lot of polarization, especially within the diaspora, unfortunately. And I feel like honestly, that's really unifying, that you are incorporating both of those like stories, because like the term Black or Blackness is just so like immense, you know what I mean? Just like, it is really a diaspora. So
Yeah, it is. And I guess I can ask questions too. So the question I would ask you is, if you're doing creative writing as well, how are you bringing that sensibility or that knowledge firsthand that Blackness is more diverse than the descendant of U.S. enslaved people? How are you bringing that into your work?
wow, thank you. Really made me think. I mean, I particularly like really love speaking about my identity in my work. I mean, I primarily write poetry, and I grew up in Philly, which is a very Black city. I think named one of the blackest cities in America. And like, I do like speaking on the experiences, I've had or witnessed my peers having, growing up in the inner city, but then going home to my like Sierra Leone immigrant mother, you know what I mean? Because like there is a certain like whiplash, I guess, with that in a way, but I also simultaneously really love it, like I love just the fact that, like I mean, the food is really great, I will say, on both sides, but just like, like listening, like sitting in my dad's car and listening to like protest music and like, 90s hip hop, but then like hanging out with my mom and like hearing like Afro beats and stuff like that. And I do really like incorporating, I mean, music in general as a musician, like I like incorporating music into my poetry and making it almost sound musical, but like I also love bringing about specific cultural references or even like using like slang. And honestly, like I will say, like you bringing this up really makes me want to challenge myself to, because I feel like I can honestly expand upon like those my two cultural sides even more, because I feel like I've tried to do that a little bit, but this is honestly inspiring me to challenge myself a little bit more and like write more about that. So thank you for the question.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Can't wait to read some of what you put together.
I also can't wait to read about that, Zora. I feel like as a child of immigrants as well, I kind of resonate in the sense that I'm living kind of two worlds at once when I'm here at college, just when I go back home. But I do want to ask a question about the everyday experience of Black people. I'm trying to gather my thoughts because I want to like refer back to other points we made in the conversation, but let me just ask this question first. That was specifically regarding your book, Living While Black. Do you think that Living While Black has changed in some ways for the youth today relative to your generation or to even previous generations? Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Hmm. Oh, it's such a good question. And it's one of the things I love about being a professor is that I'm always in touch with people who are 18 to 24, and so I get a sense of how the world is changing. And I would say it is, and it is not a perfect country by any means. It's not a perfect world by any means. But some of the things that we just took for granted when I was, say, in college or high school are now, I'd say, happen less today. But also, young people have higher standards than we did in terms of, when the everyday racism that I experienced. I, you know, I credit with my parents with letting me know, "Get- this is what's going to happen. This is how these people are going to see you." And so I was inoculated, but against the microaggressions and sometimes macroaggressions that I experienced. I did not like it, but um, but I knew that it was going to be a part of my experience. Some of the things that we didn't accept them, and we definitely, there were protests when I was an undergraduate, um, but like I said, I just quite simply the standards that students of color, queer students, women students, working class students, and poor students bring, for example, to high schools and particularly to college campuses, the standards are higher. They actually have a name, microaggressions, for things that we just assumed were the price of holding space with people who had the power of the majority. And that is remarkable. And that speaks volumes. And it is, I know it sounds very weird to say this, but the United States is having a movement when you step away from the newspapers and you look at the experiences of people. We are moving more towards greater acceptance, not just tolerance, but acceptance of the full diversity of what it is to be a person in the United States. I do have a lot of hope, um, despite some of the things that we see transpiring today.
Yeah, I mean, hearing you reflect upon ways that your parents spoke to you as a child and said, these are the aggressions that you will face. Like, this is the way that the world will represent you. I think that that's a really common experience for marginalized groups, and especially Black Americans. I'm curious, 1001 Black Men, a lot of your work is more maybe geared towards an adult audience, but your most recent book, What Do Brothers Do All Day, is a children's book. And so what made you decide to pivot towards that? This is a three-part question. What made you decide to pivot towards that audience? What challenges did you encounter thinking about how to, in working with children and doing something for children? And then in general, how do you talk to kids about, I've spent a couple of years as a teacher, but how do you talk to kids about complicated questions like race, gender, and power?
I like all of those questions. What Do Brothers Do All Day became a children's book because I'm very active in the zine community in the Bay Area, and I created a zine called What Do Brothers Do All Day, and it was really sarcastic, inspired by Richard Scarry, but also by the fact that people were always so curious about Black people. There's a great New Yorker cartoon, which I won't describe, but it's about, how people are wondering, what are Black people thinking? And so I thought, I'm just gonna, instead of children wondering what grown-ups do, I'm gonna do one that's what do people who aren't Black wonder, well, what do Black people do? And so I did a series of drawings within 1001 Black Men, bundled them into a zine. And the first drawing was actually a collaged picture of a couple of white men from a 1950s magazine looking curious. And then I put the caption, they were wondering, what do brothers do all day? But some children's librarians in the Bay Area pulled me aside and took me out to lunch and said, this looks like a children's book to us. And so when I had the opportunity to pitch a book to Chronicle Books, I pitched that book. And then it became a children's book. And so I redrew everything and I added, it has twice as many drawings as originally. And as, converting it to a children's book, you have to think about things that you don't otherwise think about. I changed the tone to something that's much less ironic. And then my goal was to show kids a lot of different ways of being Black men, being as inclusive as a lot of different of diversity within Black maleness as I possibly could. But it was interesting because although I'm African American, I did have a sensitivity reader who was also Black, who read the book and told me what they found problematic. And so I ended up redrawing the initial 2 pages of the book and therefore the initial final pages of the book. And also the cover that is on that book is the third cover I ended up doing. I did a second cover because the kids were drinking and eating sugary snacks on the cover, and that was not something that book publishers want to necessarily advance. And then I added more movement because I loved my second cover with lots of different Black men and dressed for different jobs. But they were standing at a corner waiting for the light to change. And someone saw the cover pre-production and said, this looks like men standing around on a corner. Looks like a stereotype. So I went back in and redrew it so that the people are moving back and forth. And so all of these concerns are things that I never think about. Living while Black did not have a sensitivity reader and nothing changed at all. So this was a fascinating experience. Yeah. And I know there was a third part to your question, which I did not answer.
Just in general, like how do we talk to kids about really complicated topics?
I think I have 2 nieces, and I try to, I always want to start by asking them, well, what do you think about these things? And what have you heard? And what are kids saying? And then sharing my own experiences has been helpful. I would say what I have found with them is that complicated things become less complicated when you answer children's questions the first time they ask. It becomes more and more complicated once they get a sense that this is something that's hard for adults to talk about. Luckily, as an African American literature professor, race is not hard for me to talk about. And so, I'm glad you asked that. That's a great question. I try to bring that sensibility to the art that I make for kids now.
I love that you brought up the process of talking openly and honestly with your nieces as just such a fundamental work of slowly chipping away at the injustices and helping them get more used to talking about racial injustice and hope and political systems. And I think that really highlights how in so much of your work you talk about how resistance occurs at that level of everyday life, right? That it's that kind of daily, almost boring routines that end up being, which are often not considered particularly meaningful when we think about it. But as you point out, those are also the contexts where, many Black folk most profoundly experience the racist systems and prejudices, right? That's, living while Black, driving while Black, all those things, right? Just doing these daily things are often where, racism really just like makes itself known. And so I was just wondering, as you've written about everyday resistance and kind of these daily patterns of changing the world, so to speak, have your daily habits shifted at all? Or what are some elements that you maybe find yourself more, intentionally changing how you live your daily life to make it more, of a resistance?
That's a great question because, I as a really nerdy person, I not my rebellion or my politics basically mostly play themselves out through my drawings. But in terms of how I live every day, one of the biggest changes that I have made is I actually go out of my way to make eye contact with and greet young African American men when I'm walking down the street, especially at night, um, because I am more. I've always, I'm more focused now on the ways that the gulf between how people experience themselves and how they are experienced by others. And so that is really important for me to affirm. It's a little way of affirming the humanity of folks who simply because of who they are not seen as people. And that's really become important to me. When and also I'm more having done so much work around Black people and representation, I think a lot more about other groups and representation. And I'm really making efforts to always educate myself, read more graphic novels, expose myself to more artists, and both in person, as in people I know in real life, but also the work of more artists who are in marginalized groups of which I am not a part. Um, and to kind of come at the work of these different artists with humility. And it's not the job of the artist to teach me something, but what I think is really important is to understand how other groups want to be seen, what artists are celebrated by other groups, and specifically focused here in the United States, and support those artists and writers. So those are some things that I've brought much more intentionality to. Yeah.
I love that. It really challenges me to think of my everyday life as something that can be really expansive and that can like push me out into the world. Because I think I often think of it in terms of what I retreat to, and how I keep the world sort of at bay. But yeah, just like really incorporating casual experiences of other art, other perspectives, and other just acknowledging the humanity in everyone around me. That's so simple, but it's really profound, and I'm so grateful just for everything that you've said. We are out of time, but I'm gonna have Amy close us out with just one more question.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Mance. I've learned so much in an hour, and I kind of wish I was one of your students. I could continue learning. But just to close off, what are some projects or artworks you recommend our listeners check out? And do you have anything coming out soon that we should look out for?
I definitely recommend in terms of other folks' work, Ebony Flowers' Hot Comb, really great graphic collection of short stories by an African American woman who did her dissertation at the University of Wisconsin as a graphic novel. Pretty amazing artist and writer. Also, I love to give a shout out to the book's been out for a few years now, but T. Bowie's The Best We Could Do, an absolutely stunning graphic novel in which she in real life, spent 10 years researching and traveling to understand her parents' migration experience from Vietnam. Beautiful book. And also Nidhi Chanani's Pashmina. It's a very quick read as a graphic novel, but it is so layered about the experiences of South Asian women in India and here in the United States. And it's all ages. I think it's YA book, but wow, in a very short amount of space, that's a quick read. Nidhi Chanani does amazing things. My latest publication was actually a short story that I'm really like, and I've gotten great feedback on, in an anthology called We Belong. It's the first, as far as anyone knows, it's the first LGBTQ science fiction comics anthology from Stack Deck Press, and my short story is about the Black Pride cookout in outer space. So um, that's got other projects in the works, but that's the one that I'll share today.
I cannot wait. That sounds amazing. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mance. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope this was wonderful for everybody watching and that everyone can take away just at least one of the many, many things that we've learned today. Just thank you again for your time, Dr. Mance, and just for all the work you're doing and have been doing and will continue to do. I look forward to following your career and just everything else that you put out there into the world. So wanted to say thank you to all of our viewers. Just a reminder that this will be up on dublab tomorrow, and you can share it with friends and family and everyone else. Thank you so much, y'all, and we'll be back in a couple months. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.